Hey, welcome to part 3 of To Be Honest. Today, I want to tackle the greatest obstacle that most people face in a relationship with God. This obstacle is the obstacle of guilt. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, oh, I'm so glad I watched today's talk because we're going to be talking about guilt. Well, the reality is, it's the greatest obstacle that people face in a relationship with God, but not just a relationship with God. This is a huge obstacle in all relationships. So even if you're not a follower of Jesus, I think today's talk is going to be important for you. I want to give you a tool today that will help to remove guilt from relationships, including a relationship with God. That's right, remove the guilt, not just move it. And as a bonus, even if you're not a follower of Jesus, this will help you in all other relationships. And that's why I'm convinced watching today's talk will actually improve your life. So let's take a look. Before we dive into tackling this obstacle of guilt, let's do a quick recap of what we've learned over the past couple of talks. We discovered in part 1 of this series that our honesty in a relationship actually will be equal to our intimacy in that relationship. The more honest we are, the more intimacy that we'll experience. And we said that in our relationship with God, the depth of our relationship is going to equal the depth of our honesty with God. I encouraged you to answer 4 questions. What are you sad about? What are you mad about, glad about, or even anxious about? You're beginning to write your own Psalms, just like David did. You're writing the things that are on your heart and on your mind, and you're being honest to God about those things. In part 2 of this series, we talked about the idea of doubts. We said that we may not be able to remove our doubts completely, but praise is a tool that helps them to be moved, because our doubts block the truth about who God really is. Our feelings block the facts about who God is in our lives. But praise can be a tool that we use to move the doubts even if we can't remove them. Today we're talking about guilt. It's an obstacle in our relationship with God, just like doubt, but the difference is this: we can actually remove it. And I can't wait to share the tool of how you can remove it today. Before we get to that though, all of us experience guilt, but there's actually a difference between feeling guilty and being guilty. You know what I'm talking about because you've probably gotten an email from your boss saying, hey, I'd like to meet with you on Monday morning at 8 o'clock, and you've felt guilty all weekend, but you weren't sure if you were actually guilty. Then on Monday morning, you discovered that you weren't being guilty of anything because you got a promotion or you got some great news from your boss. The same happens for those of you that get a text from your mom and dad and you find out they want to have a family meeting. You feel guilty for the next couple of hours before the meeting, only to discover that they're announcing the great holiday that you're going on this summer together as a family. See, there's a difference between feeling guilty and being guilty. Whether you're feeling guilty or you're actually being guilty of something, we all hate the feeling. We don't like the experience of guilt. So how do we solve this problem of the feeling of guilt that we all experience? To be honest, most of us, when it comes to guilt, we tend to solve it by just dismissing it. We try to avoid it, we try not to think about it, or perhaps we even blame other people to try and dismiss our guilt. The problem with dismissing guilt is this: it just keeps coming back over and over again. You've tried not to think about it, you've tried to dismiss it, but it keeps coming back. The real solution to guilt is this: it's dealing with it. If we want to solve the guilt issue, we've got to stop dismissing it and start dealing with it. Stop dismissing guilt, start dealing with guilt. When it comes to dealing with guilt, the good news for us is that the key player in our story throughout this series, King David, the second king of Israel, he was no stranger to guilt. He dealt with guilt much of his adult life. As we talked about in the first part of this series, David was guilty of some pretty serious transgressions. He slept with another man's wife, got her pregnant, then killed him off to try and cover up the whole thing. It destroyed his legacy, his family, and even his kingdom. But David dealt with his guilt. And as we're going to see from his journals today, you don't just have to dismiss guilt. You can actually deal with it. In the height of David's guilt, because of his sin of adultery and murder, he penned these words in his journal in the famous Psalm 51. He said, "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love, according to your great compassion, blot out my transgressions." That word love there is the same word, hesed love, the Hebrew word that describes God's unfailing, everlasting love. It's the same word that he used many times throughout his journal. In fact, we talked about it in part 2 of this series when David used praise to move his doubts about God's character. He goes on to say this. In his journal, he writes, "Wash away my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin, for I know my transgressions and my sin is always before me." Then David does something that's a little bit unusual. Listen to these words. He says this in verse 4 of Psalm 51. "Against you, God, you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight." I don't know if Uriah overheard that or not. That's Bathsheba's husband that David murdered. But I'm wondering if he overheard that or saw David's journal, whether he might have asked the question, wait a second, David, you didn't just sin against God, you sinned against me and my entire family as well. So why is it that David said, "Against you, God, and you only have I sinned"? Listen to what he says further on in his journal. He says this, "Against you, you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight. So you are right, God, in your verdict and justified when you judge." Here's what David is identifying. David is identifying that God is the one who sets the standard of what is right and what is wrong. And although he broke God's standard and it affected a lot of people, he dealt with the person first that set the standard. It's God's standard that David had broken. And so David says, "God, I've sinned against you." Not just against these other people, but primarily, I've sinned against you. At the same time that David is penning these words in his journal, he also wrote another psalm, another journal entry that describes for us how we can actually deal with our guilt, not by dismissing it, but actually dealing with it. Listen to these words in Psalm 32. "When I kept silent, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day long. For day and night your hand was heavy on me, my strength was sapped as in the heat of summer." David's describing what it's like to not deal with your guilt. Night and day, he was groaning because of the weight of the guilt. His strength was taken from him because he wasn't dealing with his guilt. But then he actually dealt with it. Listen to these words. He says, "Then I acknowledged my sin. I acknowledged my sin to you and did not cover up my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord." Notice the difference between when he was dismissing his guilt and when he was dealing with it, because he admitted it, he acknowledged it, and he confessed it before the Lord. After he acknowledged his guilt, it says this in his journal, "And you forgave the guilt of my sin." Notice that David didn't say that God forgave just his sins. He actually includes the fact that God gave him forgiveness with his guilt as well. That teaches us this lesson. To be honest with God about your guilt allows you to experience the freedom of forgiveness. Listen to the following words from his same journal entry about the forgiveness he experienced. "Therefore," he says, "let all the faithful pray to you while you may be found. Surely the rising of the mighty waters will not reach them. You are my hiding place. You will protect me from trouble. You surround me with songs of deliverance." David begins to experience what freedom of forgiveness really looks like. he begins to experience what freedom from guilt can look like as well. So what does it look like for you? And what does it look like for me to experience that same forgiveness, that same freedom from guilt that David wrote about in his journal? For the final time in our series, I want to invite you to grab a journal, and I want you to do 3 things in your journal as it relates to guilt. We learned from David that it starts by acknowledging your guilt. That's where it begins. So start with that letter A and admit and acknowledge what you've done. This is not for those of you that are feeling guilty about something, but something that you're actually guilty of. So that feeling of being guilty because you've actually done something, you begin removing that guilt by acknowledging what you've done. Just write it in your journal. Acknowledge the thing that you've done, that standard that maybe you've broken that God has created. Then the second thing I want you to do starts with the letter B. The first, A, acknowledge what you've done. B, believe that God has forgiven you. See, your Heavenly Father loves you so much that He sent His Son Jesus into the world to die on a cross, but not just to stay dead. He rose again from the dead 3 days later, and by rising again from the dead, He actually proved He has power over death and sin and guilt. By believing in Jesus and believing that He has forgiven you for that thing that you've just admitted, you actually break the power of sin and guilt in your life through the power of what Jesus did when He rose again from the dead. So write down, God, I believe that you have broken the power of sin and guilt in my life. And then the last thing I want you to do starts with the letter C. A, admit what you've done wrong, acknowledge it. B, believe that God has broken the power of sin and death over your guilt because of what He did for you on the cross and when He rose again from the dead. And then finally, confess it all to Him. Confess that you don't have the power to overcome your guilt, but you know that He does. Acknowledge it, believe it, and confess it. That's the way that you deal with guilt in your life and not just dismiss it. Here's a wonderful truth. Jesus' best friend, John, he wrote these words about Jesus and forgiveness. He said that if you are willing to confess your sin, Jesus is faithful and just to forgive you of your sin. That's a guarantee you can take to the bank. From Jesus' best friend, John, if you're willing to confess your sin, Jesus is faithful and just to forgive it. I love the fact that we don't have to dismiss our guilt. We can deal with it and we can actually remove it. I love this powerful quote from the great theologian Stuart Briscoe. He said this about guilt: "There is unspeakable joy for the person who knows release from guilt and the relief of forgiveness." Have you experienced the relief of forgiveness and the release of your guilt? I actually would love nothing more than for every single person watching this to experience what that's really like. Wait a minute. One last thing. I've been carrying this backpack around with me throughout this entire talk, and the weight of it reminds me of the weight of guilt. See, we try to adjust it, we try to move it around, just like we do with our guilt, to try and be comfortable with it, but we're never comfortable with our guilt. Just like when I take this backpack off, I'll experience the weight being released from my body. The same is true with guilt. When you finally take it off, you are released of the guilt and you feel the relief of forgiveness. Just like Stuart Briscoe said, there is unspeakable joy for the person that experiences the release of guilt and the relief of forgiveness. Just like I experienced the relief of taking that backpack off, I want you to experience the relief of forgiveness. And it only comes through confession. So this week, confess it to God and experience the relief of His forgiveness.